Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to our Aware webinar series. Our Aware webinars take place on the second Wednesday of every month. And this month, we're going to be talking about anxiety, what it is, and what can help to reduce it. So we're just going to take a moment now to allow people to join. So just taking a moment to get settled, and we'll get going shortly. So welcome along everyone who's joining in. My name is Dr. Susan Brannick. I'm a clinical psychologist and a clinical director with Aware. So just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with Aware, we provide free support services and wellbeing programs for anyone impacted by anxiety, depression and bipolar disorder, and including those supporting loved ones. So for more information on our services, do have a look at our website, aware.ie. And today in our webinar, we're going to be talking about anxiety, as I said, what it is, what can help to reduce it. So just before we get going and I introduce my guest, there will be an opportunity to ask questions as we go throughout the webinar. So via the Q&A box, we may not be able to get to all of the questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. So do put in things that you're wondering about or things that you might like to ask either of us about anxiety, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I'm really, really delighted now to be able to introduce my guest today, Dr. Clodagh Campbell. So you might be familiar with Clodagh as the wellness psychologist or from her popular podcast, Unspoken. Clodagh, you're really, really welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really love the fact that you're having these really important conversations and what a resource it is for people. So I'm delighted to be joining you to talk about anxiety.
Great. Yeah, and really looking forward to our conversation today. So as I was saying, we're going to talk a bit about what anxiety is and maybe the sorts of things that can help with it. But maybe before we get into that, I wonder if you might be able to tell us a bit more about yourself and maybe your journey into becoming a psychologist.
Absolutely. So I am a mum to two little girls. I have a wonderful husband, and I am a psychologist. I graduated from my doctorate from Trinity in 2015, and I worked for a large public sector organisation then for about 7 years or so. And after having my second daughter, I decided that I would leave working in such a large environment and set up private practice. And at the time, I set up my Instagram page, The Wellness Psychologist, and I've since launched my podcast, Unspoken. But everything I do is with so much passion to support people who feel alone or who are struggling or who are just navigating the challenges of life that are really, really normal, that we all experience, but helping people to feel less alone in that and to realize that we are actually all really similar in those experiences. We just don't talk about them all that often. And what led me to becoming a psychologist and to having that passion was the fact that I struggled in my teens and my 20s. I felt really alone. I was navigating anxiety, low self-worth, low mood, because I experienced, I suppose, an attachment trauma is what I would call it, but I was given up for adoption when I was a brand new newborn baby. And because of that, and because of the experiences that were part of that, I really struggled. And I spent years and years and years feeling very ashamed of that and feeling like it was a weakness to struggle, to experience anxiety and low mood, and to struggle to form my identity and to feel safe in my relationships. But actually, the more work that I've done and the longer I've become that I've been a psychologist, I've recognized that we all go through these challenges, and we as humans are predisposed to experiencing these emotions and these challenges and the hard days as well as the good days. So yes, I feel very passionate in helping other people to see that and to learn how to support themselves during those challenging times.
It's really interesting, isn't it? As you say, it's so normal, but it's not often talked about. I sound like maybe I'm doing an ad for your podcast now, but it's really true, isn't it? So as you say, that we all struggle, but I guess there's something about feeling very alone in that a lot of the time, isn't there? And thinking that your experiences might be different to other people's, or yeah, maybe other people don't struggle in the same way. And I guess as you say, it's really interesting. That's kind of a key part of what you're offering, that kind of normalizing, and also kind of yeah, I guess bringing into that kind of public kind of conversations actually. And maybe as psychologists, we don't always do that in terms of even in the helping professions, that we have our own difficulties and we manage them in different ways. And I think you talk a lot about being very authentic in that as well, don't you? And kind of offering that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can have this perception that other people have everything together because we just see the exterior and we don't see the internal. It's like that analogy where there's the duck gliding on the water and they look like it's smooth sailing, but underneath the feet are paddling furiously. And we see the external, we see these happy families or these rosy pictures or people that are really succeeding in their career or who seem to have it all. And actually, beneath every person, there is that franticness and there is that struggle to balance and juggle all of the balls and to keep everything on the road and to I suppose just survive the navigation of life. Life is beautiful and so rewarding and so full of joy, but it also can be really difficult, particularly when we are juggling lots of different roles and responsibilities and balls. So yes, I think shining a light on the fact that none of us find it easy.
Yeah.
And that often the challenges that we're experiencing are experienced by the people around us. We're just not talking about it enough. We're not sharing it enough. And when we do connect in those vulnerable conversations and say, oh, I'm feeling really anxious today, or I'm really struggling. I'm in this season of my life where my children are really young and that's hard. I'm doing my best to support them, but I don't know if I'm always getting it right. When we talk about this, it makes us feel more together, more connected, less alone. And that is a really powerful thing.
Yeah, and definitely backed up by the research as well, isn't it? In terms of not just anxiety, but maybe mental health problems more generally, that the kind of connection is almost like the antidote or the vaccine to that kind of isolation, or then that kind of more ruminative headspace. Yeah, everyone else is doing it better than me. I'm the only one struggling. So it's nice to connect, but it's also quite therapeutic, isn't it? As you say, and it shifts everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently ran an event where I had 30 women in a room for a morning together, and people very generously talked about what they were struggling with in their lives during our meditations, and we had a sound bath and we had lots of other beautiful moments throughout the morning. But the feedback from everybody was the most powerful part of it was sitting with other women who were sharing the reality of their lives and the struggles and the self-doubt and the overwhelm and the anxiety and the fear. So really recognizing that we're not alone is so powerful.
And I guess maybe that the stories that in terms of people are bringing to the podcast, I just find that really interesting, because I think as a culture, we're not, in some ways we're great at talking, aren't we? But also not very good at talking about things that might be more painful, or as you say, maybe kind of put us into more of a vulnerable place. And I wonder about your experience of that and maybe what you hear back from, I guess, kind of as those, people's own experiences, that they're unique, aren't they? But there's also a common thread of them that can connect people.
Yeah. People really appreciate somebody sharing their vulnerability.
Yeah.
People really, really appreciate that. And actually, those people that do are always perceived as very brave and very strong and very resilient, probably the opposite of what you would expect to be viewed as when you're sharing such a vulnerable, authentic story. So my experience is that we'll talk about topics such as bipolar disorder, anxiety, trauma. We've covered topics like grey area drinking, where we had a beautiful woman, Olivia, come on, and she talked about she was drinking too much alcohol and feeling really ashamed of herself afterwards. I think the term she used was she felt she was misrepresenting herself when she was drinking alcohol. We've covered topics such as adoption, which is close to my heart. So when people come on and talk about these topics and share their experience of navigating these things throughout their lives, people that are listening connect with that.
Yeah.
And they, even if it's a topic that isn't relevant to them, there'll be themes that the person is talking about that they will relate to, like how their self-worth may have been impacted by their journey, how perhaps they struggled with a sense of belonging, how they felt a sense of impending doom, perhaps, or of loneliness, or of self-doubt, or people pleasing. Are you finding it difficult to uphold boundaries in their lives? So people always relate to when other people share their authentic vulnerability and their stories and their experiences, and we feel connected in that. And my experience since starting the podcast is that it's really celebrated, and people, I think, are really ready now to hear these stories and to share their stories, and for us not to live in that kind of pretend, mode anymore, where we just get on with things. People are ready to actually stop and say, I'm struggling and this is hard, and let's connect together in that, because this is true and it's real. And I think in the past, we have, maybe in our culture, we've been encouraged to be very private or to keep things within our family homes. But now we're changing those generational aspects, and we are saying, I'm ready to talk about this, and I'm ready to share my experience, and I'm ready to hear other people's experiences, because this is real life.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess with kind of people who sort of championing that also kind of publicly, and it makes me think of, because I really enjoy the podcast actually, and I guess hearing people's experiences, it's fascinating, and I guess listening to your own one on anxiety, I really wonder what that was like to do. I guess kind of like the kind of shifting seats almost. So you were the person kind of in the speaking role and sharing your unspoken.
I felt really, really nervous, really anxious. It felt very exposing for me to as a psychologist, to sit there and say, I've really, experienced anxiety throughout my whole life, and that's really impacted me. And I've had to work really hard to manage that and to look after myself in that. So it felt very exposing, but it felt like something that was important for me to do, and I asked that of other people. I have this fear that when I'm really honest and I share my own vulnerability or my own struggles, that people will perceive me as less competent as a psychologist. So I really fear that. That's probably one of my greatest fears when I am so honest. And I try to counteract that with the thought that actually perhaps people will feel like I'll be better able to understand them if they know that I'm human too, and that I've had my own difficulties, and that I have to really look after myself and nurture myself when I'm tired, or when I'm sleep deprived, or when I'm having a particularly difficult time in my life, whether it be because, one of my daughters is having lots of tantrums, or because I'm feeling really disconnected, or feeling really burnt out or overwhelmed. We all go through those experiences, but my fear sometimes is when I talk about them and I share it, people will worry that I'll be less able to support them. That hasn't been my experience. It's always been welcomed so wholly, because people recognize that I'm human, and that the compassion that I feel for them comes in part from the experiences that I've gone through.
and even naming that fear, I think, is quite progressive, So it's sort of exploring that experience of anxiety, because that's really common, isn't it? And we'll go on to talk a bit more about anxiety, but that really abject feeling of being openly exposed and kind of your worst fears. And I was listening to something recently about sort of that idea of how we'll talk about maybe one of the kind of things that can help anxiety is exposure. And as you said, doing something. And I think what you described there is, it's not just doing something for the sake of it, it's because it mattered to you, it has value, and it can offer something to other people as well. So that's kind of what drives us, isn't it? To bring along our anxiety, even when we're doing something that can be hard. But I guess even this description of, if you had kind of thought the world was flat for, hundreds of years, you're not just going to set sail off in a boat and hope for the best. It's about a graded sort of building confidence, isn't it, to do things so step by step, because I guess anxiety can give a lot of different predictions, can't it? And you gave a nice example there that people will think X or Y, and people might have different experiences, or like if I expose this about myself or show this, then people will think a certain thing, or if I do X, then this is going to happen. So anxiety it has a lot to say, doesn't it? And worry has a lot of options it'll offer you that aren't always that helpful. So maybe if we start kind of moving into just thinking about what anxiety is then. And I suppose I was thinking a bit about that, even just the difference between fear and anxiety, because I suppose anxiety is talked about a lot, isn't it? And I suppose it'd be interesting to hear what you think about this, but I suppose maybe that fear is sort of I guess it's a very normal response, isn't it? It keeps us alive. It has an evolutionary basis. And I suppose it's sort of, am I in danger now? Whereas anxiety is sort of maybe a discomfort or an stress maybe, or worry about the future threat. So I guess that sort of idea that a level of fear is going to be kind of needed for us to kind of go about our daily lives. But anxiety I guess it can become a problem, can't it, if we're perceiving threat in places where we shouldn't. So I guess anxiety is maybe that body's threat detection system being kind of permanently switched on, isn't it? And obviously the fight or flight response is involved in that, and kind of thinking about all the things that are involved there in terms of sort of ways of thinking, kind of what happens in your body, kind of heart racing, stomach sort of going, and they'll be very understandable to people as we're kind of listening. I wonder, just thinking about that idea about kind of fear and anxiety, and maybe what you see in terms of kind of how people describe anxiety to you even.
Yeah, I think often at the moment, the people that I'm working with or the people that I'm connecting with on Instagram, our lives are really busy, really, really busy. And, to go back to what I mentioned earlier, we're juggling lots of balls. And I think anxiety can show up a lot nowadays because we are stretched so thinly and we are doing so much, and we are trying to keep up with this pace of life that's normalized now. So it can be the symptom of us doing more than we're capable of doing on a long-term basis. So that fear can be present, certainly for me, that I'm going to drop the ball, or I can feel my nervous system is switched on high alert all the time. I'm in that fight or flight mode where I'm rushing, and there's a sense of urgency. I'm rushing from one meeting to the next, or I'm rushing from work to collect my children from school, or I'm rushing on a Saturday morning for coffee with my friend because I don't want to be late and let them down. So I think often when we're living in this really fast-paced way and our nervous system is on high alert, it can certainly lead to us feeling that anxiety and that constant hypervigilance, that we need to be on alert, or if we drop a ball, that a disaster is going to happen. And of course, often there is no disaster that's going to happen. It can also link to, I use these terms loosely, but for the purpose of kind of describing this, I'm going to use them, that kind of real threat and imagined threat. So, for example, a real threat is when we're crossing a road and a car is speeding towards us. And then it's really functional for us to experience that fear and that anxiety because it helps us to move out of the way of the car. But often, and I experience this myself as well, we'll have these almost perceived threats or imagined threats. And I'm using the word imagined loosely, but where we are sitting at home and we're safe and everything's okay, but we're worrying about something that actually isn't happening, but in our brain, because we've sent signals to it that it's something we need to be fearful of or that there's a threat present, our body is responding to that. So, for example, I was at home recently and I thought I heard a child cry. And straight away I thought, oh, my child, I need to help my child. And I remember then that my child isn't here, my child is in school, my child is in creche. And I had this catastrophic thought of, but are they safe? So in that moment, there was no evidence that my children weren't safe. You know, they're in school where they feel comfortable, where there's lots of protocols to keep them safe. But I had this catastrophic thought, are they safe? So that was this kind of, you know, perceived or imagined threat that really led my body to feel really, really anxious. And I had to look after myself in that, to bring myself back out of that fight or flight, really scary stress response, to thinking they're safe. There's nothing for me to fear. If there was something wrong with my child now, I would be notified, or there would be a message sent to me. So yes, going back to that idea that you shared of anxiety being future-based or worrying about things that perhaps aren't happening right now. And that can be exhausting. It can be all-consuming. It can be incredibly debilitating. My anxiety has often been centered around my relationships. So my fear of being abandoned, which links to my adoption. So, for example, I spoke about this in my episode of Unspoken, that fear that if my husband was on a night out, or back years ago when we were dating, that he might, you know, meet somebody who was more attractive than me or more appealing than me, or he might get fed up of me. So that anxiety would be present for me, that kind of perceived or imagined threat when we were separated. And there was no evidence that anything negative was happening, but I was kind of telling myself that something was going on, really responding to that threat and to that anxiety in the moment.
Yeah, as if it's sort of happening, isn't it? So the brain isn't very good at distinguishing what is the what if, and it's actually happening now, isn't it? And you said so many great things there. It's hopefully I'll be able to pick up on all of them. But I guess that I guess the example you gave is really nice actually, and thank you for sharing that, because I think it can be a common sort of thing in terms of are people that I love safe, and it's a really nice example, isn't it, of that sort of very adaptive and normal fear response. It's like, as a mother, I need to act here. And then it's actually, no, hold on, they're not here. So it's fine. But then the thought comes in, isn't it? So, and as you say, and I kind of, that example, I think is quite, it can be generalized, I think, to that experience of anxiety. That thought can really take hold, can't it? It kind of comes into the mind, or those kinds of thoughts. Yeah. And as you say, there's something about, okay, well, speaking directly to the content of it. So it's okay, well, actually, no, I know for a fact that they're not here. So then it's okay, now I need to ground myself in the here and now. And I suppose we kind of briefly touched on that fight or flight, but we need to kind of calm that alarm system down. So that's the other part of it, isn't it? And as you say, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because anxiety is huge as a topic. So the example that you gave about your husband, it's good, isn't it? Because there's a link between the sorts of, maybe, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but the things that might cue or trigger anxiety for different people. And for you, you're able to kind of make those links. So that can be helpful for people as well in terms of making a deeper sense of some of the triggers for anxiety. So I would see it maybe as having two tasks. So when you're feeling anxious, and I know this and you know this and everyone knows this, you just can't think. You can't function. Your prefrontal cortex has gone offline. It's gone off, off on a break. So there's not much kind of capacity to be able to hold things in mind. So there's a task of sort of calming things down first. And then maybe whether that's in therapy or something self-guided, there's another process of trying to make sense of maybe of deeper issues, of the things that stimulate anxiety or generate it, or that make someone, the things that might make me feel under threat might be different for you, and what makes you feel under threat. So I guess it's sort of that kind of knowing yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
And
the first,
even having that awareness in the moment that it's happening for us.
yeah.
So often we can experience this spiral where we'll have a catastrophic thought or an intrusive thought, and we can kind of, it can build and build and build and continue to grow, and the fear grows. And I've gotten much better at catching it when it's happening and looking after myself in that. But sometimes it's very hard to do that. So it can spiral, and we can be so consumed by that, that, you know, we find it really hard to do our job, or we find it really hard to be present. You know, you could be sitting having coffee with a friend, and often I'll talk to people and they'll describe this, and I've certainly experienced it myself. We can be really in our head thinking, why did I say that? That was really insensitive for me to say. And from there, we can go to, they're not going to want to be my friend anymore. They're going to think that I'm, you know, not a thoughtful person, that I'm not a good friend. It can really spiral. So catching it when it's happening, recognizing, okay, I'm really having an experience right now in my head. I'm having this experience where I'm judging myself and criticizing myself, where I'm experiencing this fear. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at what's after happening. My friend is still talking to me. She's still smiling at me. She hasn't gotten up and left the coffee date. I think I'm probably maybe overreacting in this situation, or letting myself spiral. So I think having that awareness in the moment can be really helpful as well. But of course, that's a skill, isn't it? It's building that skill that you're able to start recognizing, and it takes a lot of practice.
It does, but I guess luckily anxiety gives us a lot of opportunities to practice, doesn't it? And I guess it's sort of, if you don't catch it before, maybe you'll catch it in the moment, and if you don't catch it in the moment, you'll be able to reflect on it after. So it's always possible to get some sort of insight, as you say. And maybe I often think a helpful way to kind of try to catch that is to kind of come back into the body maybe and notice what's sort of going on. So if I'm like really focused on a kind of a problem, let's say, that doesn't have an emotional charge for me, my body's probably going to feel very different to if I'm worried, as you said, about having said something stupid and upsetting someone. So your body's going to be a good kind of it'll give good signals to say, am I feeling anxious? So it's about maybe, as you say, kind of recognizing that and using different channels to kind of access that. So that doesn't necessarily mean falling into the experience or being overwhelmed by it, but it's about maybe bringing in that kind of maybe curious attention. So, okay, I'm noticing my stomach's gone a bit nervous, or I'm starting to sweat, or my heart rate's kind of gone a bit. So, okay, what's sort of happening for me? So that can be a way to maybe, I guess, step out of that thinking mind a bit as well, can't it?
Yeah. And using our environment then to bring us back into the present too. So in that instance that we were talking about, if you're having a coffee with your friend, really just using your sense of touch, holding the cup in your hand, feeling the ceramic, or taking a sip of your coffee or your tea and using your taste to ground you, or the sounds in the room, really focusing back in on what your friend is talking about, or even the feeling of the chair, the colors in the room around you. Looking, there's, you know, blue in my environment now. So really using your senses to bring you back into the moment and to ground you can really help in that moment too.
Yeah, it's really helpful to kind of hold that in mind, isn't it? That there can be routes back, because oftentimes it can feel a bit overwhelming. And I suppose maybe there's something about worry too. It's probably worth saying here in terms of the different ways that we might understand worry, because that can really kind of take hold, can't it? And I suppose there's different ways of kind of making sense of that. Maybe some approaches would say, I suppose it can give us the it can kind of give us the illusion of taking control over something. So it's sort of, I guess there's that idea like we're not very good at managing that uncertainty. So have we upset that friend or not? We don't know. There's a bit of uncertainty in that. So worry can be, I suppose, a bit of a way. This isn't like a conscious thing necessarily that we do, but I suppose it gives the appearance of problem solving, doesn't it? And it can feel like it maybe for sometimes it can lessen the bodily experience of anxiety, but in the end kind of keeps that cycle going in the longer term. So I suppose it's kind of worth thinking kind of how important it is maybe to develop that awareness when worry is happening. And I suppose checking in with your lived experience, has it helped you solve the problem? Has it yielded any answers? Has it kind of helped you gain certainty? I guess predominantly it doesn't tend to, does it?
No. And I think the older I get, or the more work perhaps I do on myself, I recognize now the value in actually just sharing our experiences. So if we're sitting with somebody and we're having an internal experience, oh my God, I really put my foot in it, to say it to them, to just say, I'm really worrying now that I've upset you. I'm really sorry if I said something really clumsily, and actually just checking in with the person, how they are, and if you have upset them. Often it will be, gosh, no, not at all. But sometimes it might be, maybe that was a little bit insensitive, and you can just apologize for it. So that really helps me now, just to name my internal experience out loud with the other person. And whether that's saying, oh, Susan, I feel really anxious this morning logging on to our talk together, or whether it's saying to a friend, did I just put my foot in it? I'm really sorry if I did. Or maybe it's just saying to your partner, I feel really anxious today. I'm not quite sure why, but a hug would really help me right now.
Yeah. I guess it speaks to that what you mentioned before. It's sort of that authenticity maybe to a degree, and sort of a bit more of a kind of real conversation, as opposed to sort of your mind being somewhere completely different and your friend is thinking, God, she's not even interested in what I'm telling her, but your mind is saying is still back 10 minutes ago. So maybe it sort of neutralizes that a bit, doesn't it? And it makes me think a bit about the kind of, I suppose, in that kind of Buddhist idea of the two arrows, so maybe of suffering. So the first arrow is anxiety, and the second arrow that someone can be shot with is that self-criticism, the judgment. I shouldn't feel anxious. I'm not, I won't be seen as good enough, or I should be better than this. I shouldn't feel anxiety. So there's two levels of suffering. The anxiety is bad enough without the extra layer that we kind of can give to ourselves. And I wonder about your experience of that in terms of the shame that can also go along with that experience of anxiety, whether feeling shame around having anxiety, or maybe, I suppose, also kind of shame or embarrassment of certain ways that we might be when we feel anxious, that might kind of take us away from how we want to be more generally as a person.
Yeah, I'm reading a book at the moment, a really beautiful book, and it's set in Japan. I think it starts in like 1913, and it's just a fictional novel, and it spans from 1913 right up to, say, the 1990s, and it's following a family. And it's really interesting because in the early part of the story, there's a mention of mental health difficulties being something to be really ashamed of. And if there is a known mental health difficulty in a family, in the book in that time, it's saying that they're not a good match, they're not a good family to marry into. And I think now that we have so much more knowledge about anxiety and about mental health difficulties, we realize that it's a part and parcel of life. Our mental health is something that we all have and that we all need to nurture. And anxiety is something that we all experience to some extent. So I think now when we have that knowledge and we're more open about talking about it, the shame dissipates. So there's a really beautiful saying, when shame is shared in safe spaces, it goes, it dissolves. So it's a shared human experience. It's part of being human that we experience many of these challenges. But historically, we've berated ourselves or criticized ourselves. And that's something I still continue to do, and I need to work on, to turn to that self-compassion and to that recognition that this is a normal shared human experience that I'm going through because of something that has happened, whether that's something that's happened in the kind of the near kind of the present, or if it's something that's happened back 30 years ago. I'm experiencing this for a reason, and how I'm feeling, if I tune into it, it can help me to understand what I need in this moment, what I need to do to feel better, what I need to do to look after myself. If I'm feeling really anxious in my relationships because of that early attachment wound that I experienced when I was given up for adoption, what can I do with that now to help me to feel safer in my relationships? What can I do to look after myself and nurture myself so things don't feel as hard for me anymore? So we can criticize and berate ourselves, but I think at the end of the day, these are all symptoms and messages to us that we've had a hard time and that we need some TLC now and we need to look after ourselves. So the more we talk about it, and even the more conversations we have, like the one we're having today, will hopefully help people to recognize that these experiences are normal and that they're okay and that they're valid. And it's not a sign of weakness. It's something that we all go through. Mental health is a spectrum, and it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something that is rare. It's something that we all carry.
Yeah, and I think anxiety especially, it's so common, in terms of it's so prevalent in terms of, I think it's just part of being human, isn't it, as we say. And I suppose that idea of, it's a lovely description of that kind of maybe needing some kind of care and understanding. So as you say, there's a narrative, and maybe for a lot of people, they may not have that so clearly in a sense, but it, as you say, there can be different levels of that narrative. So maybe it's just that something happened this morning or this afternoon, and there's a bit of a sense making of, okay, well, maybe that's why I'm feeling a bit off, or maybe that's why this is a bit harder for me. Or maybe there's a longer term story of saying, well, okay, maybe I have an understanding based on who I am and my experiences growing up, and how these might have contributed, because all of our experiences shape who we are. So it's not, that's, how we've grown up, and the attachment relationships will inform who we are today. I guess that kind of psychological sort of phrase, isn't it? The past is always in the present, in terms of kind of how we relate to ourselves and to other people. But maybe there's something important in there too, that we can't diffuse a fight or flight system with more fight or flight, so that angry, critical, berating, even though it's so hard not to do it, isn't it? Because I guess it's sort of a bit like worry. It sort of offers a, like, well, if I'm hard enough on myself, I won't do it again, but actually what we know is that a self-compassionate approach, what you've just described, is it's not just kind of a nice thing to do for ourselves because we should have it, but also it has a neurological impact, doesn't it? It literally puts the brakes on the fight or flight system. So it's not just about being nice to yourself, it's about activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's about slowing things down. So, and how we can get into that kind of calmer state, isn't it? So it's, I feel like I can't say it enough in terms of how beneficial it is. And but the temptation is, isn't it, to, and maybe that's a cultural thing we have as well in Ireland, to kind of self-criticize, or to kind of make a joke of it, or kind of minimize something. But actually what we're talking about in terms of anxiety is suffering, isn't it? It might be suffering in the here and now, and quite extensive, quite serious suffering for a lot of people at different times, and trying to meet that the way we would with a friend or a loved one or a child.
It's healing. Self-compassion is so healing. So and in terms of everything, not just anxiety. So often when we talk about self-compassion, it can just sound like this nice thing that, we should be doing, but actually it's a really deeply healing tool that we can lean on.
Mm.
And it has been found time and again to be very powerful when it comes to looking after our psychological and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think certainly on my healing journey, self-compassion has been massive. And when I realized that and turned to it even more, it really transformed things for me.
Mm.
So if I could give one gift to people listening, if they could really consider how they can incorporate self-compassion into their life, even in a tiny way,
Yeah.
that would be a massive gift for people to take away from this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a gorgeous self-compassion workbook that Christian Neff, who's like the queen of self-compassion, has published. That's a really useful workbook for people to work through if self-compassion doesn't come naturally for them, which it doesn't for kind of any of us, I don't think, particularly in the culture that we've grown up in.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great book actually, and maybe we can put a link to it after from the webinar. And certainly, as you say, there's a really excuse me, lovely piece in it, isn't there, about backdraft? So the kind of the difficult response we can have to trying to offer ourselves self-compassion. So they kind of, and often if it's not something we've experienced from other caregivers, or it's something that feels maybe a bit kind of self-indulgent, or it's like a bit like putting on clothes that don't fit, maybe, in a sense. It's sort of trying to get used to it. So yeah, really great exercises in that, in terms of kind of how to build it. I suppose what we're talking about today are kind of skills in a sense as well, aren't they? So they're things that take practice. We're not going to just be good at something. You're not going to speak a language in a day or learn an instrument. It's sort of the same thing, isn't it? Building that awareness, building in that kind of curious, friendly approach to your experience, and I guess maybe taking risks, both in terms of your kind of what you might share with people, and also how you might kind of speak back to anxiety. So, well, this might make me feel anxious, but I'm doing it anyway because it matters, you know. And Clodagh, I realize we haven't got to any questions because I was so engrossed in what you were saying there. So what I might do is look at some of these questions. This is an interesting one. At what point should you seek help when dealing with anxiety? And I guess what maybe you might kind of have thoughts on that too, but what I would say maybe kind of an answer to that is probably as soon as possible. I would say maybe that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a lot of the ideas that we've sort of spoken about today, sort of kind of originate that idea of understanding kind of how we think and what we do and how that can impact how we feel. That's the basis of CBT. There's a great evidence base for that in terms of helping people reduce anxiety. So good quality CBT can help you understand patterns of anxiety and look at kind of ways out of those cycles and bringing in self-compassion, as we said. And hopefully maybe some of our conversation today as well might kind of support in that message that you're certainly not alone in experiencing it. And maybe that it is very common, but also the help is really available. I don't know if you want to add anything to that Claude, in terms of kind of when should you seek help?
I always think it's quite simple. When it's causing a difficulty in your life, you know, when you're finding it hard to be present, when you are feeling really, really anxious and it's causing you to stress, when you aren't able to do the things that you want to, and that might be as simple as meeting a friend for a coffee. That's a really good time to turn to support, and a really good place to start with that, I think, is your GP, not necessarily for medication, but just to kind of talk it over and to have a professional who's very accessible, to say, this is how I'm feeling, what do you think is going on for me? And then your GP can share different treatment options for you. And one treatment option, for example, might be meditation. It might be yoga. It's not always going to be medication. Or a GP is brilliant because they'll be able to direct you to the services that are available in your area. So, and even exercise, maybe it's that your GP will say, you know, like, are you getting out in fresh air? Are you going for a walk? That can even be incredibly helpful. Research really backs up the efficacy, how helpful exercise is. Susan talked about the prefrontal cortex earlier. When we meditate, it shrinks the part of our prefrontal cortex that releases cortisol and stress hormones. So, you know, it's again scientifically proven to really help with anxiety, with stress, with overwhelm. It helps with low mood as well. So your GP can talk to you about all of these different options. It's not just for medication, which might be a part of your journey, but it absolutely might not be either. But yeah, certainly when anxiety is when you're struggling with it, seek help. And the thing as well, I think, is sometimes we'll say, I'll wait a couple of weeks, I'll wait a month. But actually, often when we go and seek support, very quickly we will start to feel the benefits. Yeah. So in that month, if we're saying, I'll wait another month, actually, if you sought support within that month, you would likely be feeling some sense of relief from the kind of the support that's available or the tools that you incorporate. So yeah, no one needs to suffer alone. There's lots of support that's available. Yeah.
And don't wait, as you say, if it's stopping you doing the things that you want to be doing, and if it feels maybe disproportionate, it's really helpful to have a conversation with someone else. And as you say, maybe there's also the kind of things that we often forget about that are really important in terms of sleep, diet, and exercise. And the GP is great to kind of have a check-in around like what's going on in those areas too. Not to say that they're going to be a cure for it, but I guess they're the building blocks of wellness anyway, aren't they? I guess this other one is a constant sense of dread and how to deal with it.
Yeah. I was talking about impending sense of doom on Instagram the other day, and it is awful. It is like, it's so awful when you're sitting there and when you're feeling this sense of dread or that something terrible is going to happen. And there's no evidence to suggest that that's the reality, but you're sitting there and you're feeling really sick to the stomach, or you're just in that intense, debilitating, all-consuming place. It's horrible. And I think lots of the things that we've talked about can really help with that. Definitely looking at those cognitions, those thoughts that we're having, and challenging them can be really, really helpful. It's something that absolutely can shift with some work and some kind of nurturance and looking after yourself. We can shift that impending sense of doom, or certainly lessen it. What's your take on it, Susan?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there's something about kind of bringing that curiosity to it, isn't there, as well? So it's sort of, where is it? And what's the kind of resounding experience of it? So where the person might feel it in their body. And as you say, there's going to be thoughts linked to it. How accessible they are might need a little bit of exploration, but certainly that kind of mindful or kind of intentional attention to something. I think the key thing is the curiosity. So it's trying to hold back on the judgments, like, oh, okay, so what is that? Where is it? What kind of goes along with it? And kind of building that kind of perspective taking. I see another question there about kind of consuming news, which is causing anxiety but wanting to stay informed. I think that's a lovely example, because certainly at the moment there's so much news, isn't there, and so much stuff happening. And I guess that idea again of what I'd mentioned earlier about kind of how we're not great at managing uncertainty. We don't like it. Our brains aren't evolved to like it, so we want to know how things are going to go. So, and I think there's some research maybe to say that I think it's like maybe since the 2010 or early 2000s, our capacity to manage uncertainty has gotten less, so we're less good at it. We kind of find it more distressing. And that's sort of gone alongside the kind of more increase in information that we have. And certainly in the last few years, I guess that kind of continuous news cycle. So it's, I suppose, the idea that this is similar to worry too, that the kind of more information is better, is actually not true. It can actually leave us feeling more anxious and actually less certain. So I guess this idea that, like, if we can think something hard enough or long enough, we'll figure out the answer. Or if we have enough information about something, we can be sure about it. But actually, as I was saying, that isn't necessarily the case. So I would say on a very practical level, and I think you speak about this too in your Instagram, don't you, Clodagh, about really restricting certain news if it's causing you distress. Again, it's about kind of what's the value to you here, or what's important in your life. So if it's not adding much and it's causing this distress, do you need to know all about it? And I guess the question I would always ask people is, what's the function of it? And only you can answer that for you. So what are you hoping to get by this kind of consumption? And is it possible, as I said, to moderate it? So maybe once a day or once every few days. And instead of that, doing something that brings you value or meaning in your life. I don't know if you want to add into that, Clodagh, or see it differently.
My husband works from home the odd time, and it's really interesting how we spend our lunch breaks when we're at home. Because what he'll do is he'll get his lunch and he'll come and he'll sit and he'll watch the news during his lunch break as he eats his food. And that makes me feel really anxious, because I'm really sensitive to when I watch the news and I see things on the news. I can find it quite distressing. So for me, when I'm on my lunch break, I will maybe go for a walk, or I might read a book for 20 minutes, or I will do something that helps me to fill up my cup, and watching the news certainly doesn't do that for me. So I limit how often I watch it. I think it is important for us to have knowledge of what's going on in the world, but we don't need to listen to the news 4 times a day to do that. And it's okay if you're finding yourself feeling really distressed. That's normal. There's a really abnormal situation happening in our world at the moment. So when we're having these difficult responses to that, that's really normal. And so to look after yourself in that, and to be mindful of that. What do I need to look after myself at the moment when things are difficult in the world? So limiting your exposure to the news is okay. That's a way of looking after yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it? Because I guess, and certainly at the moment, maybe there can be a sense of an obligation to bear witness, but I guess a lot of people say that's not necessarily the case. So it's important to do what's right for you as a person and as an individual. As you say, if something's going to be really distressing, it's okay to do something else. And as you said, the kind of idea of what could fill up your cup, maybe sometimes people may not know that. So I would always kind of think about, in calmer times, having a list of things that offer that, whether it's on your phone or somewhere that's accessible. Because I guess that, as we're talking about today, sometimes anxiety can kind of overtake that thinking space, can't it? And kind of thinking, what do I need? As we talk about it here, can be kind of a straightforward question, but actually it's quite complex in many ways. And certainly if things are heated, or if you're feeling very anxious or upset, it can be really hard to know that. But even, I think, as you're saying, even pausing to ask that can start to, I guess we might kind of use the word regulator, it might start to calm things down a little. It's kind of taking that pause, isn't it? And that's really okay to do. It's okay to look after yourself, because how else are we going to function in the world and all the roles that we need to fulfill if we're not okay?
And our body will tell us. So if we're watching something on TV and we're feeling really anxious, that's a signal from our body. Or if we're sitting down reading a book and feeling really calm and content, that's a signal from our body that this is nice. I like this. It's helping me to feel grounded.
It's so important, isn't it? Listening to the body, and kind of it's that idea of kind of the signals that are coming really need to be heard, and we're very good at ignoring them, aren't we? Or cutting off from them, or like often we might kind of think, well, worry's in my head, and it is, but I guess if we explore it a bit more, we'll definitely find a route into the body somewhere. So it's worth kind of having that. Just thinking about another question there about sort of tips for managing social anxiety. So I suppose social anxiety is the basis, isn't it, of that kind of the kind of engine of that is the belief that people are kind of judging you badly. And the second engine is that then triggers a focus on your internal body. So am I blushing? Am I stuttering? What's going on in me, and how that might be perceived outside? What do you think, Clodagh, about kind of tips to manage that? Something that we often all have, yeah.
Yeah, I think years ago, a therapist said to me, Clodagh, when you feel anxious walking into a room, so do 90% of the people there, if not higher. And that has always stuck with me. That really changed things for me because I thought that that was, again, something that I was experiencing that wasn't normal or that wasn't happening for other people. So now when I walk into a room and I'm feeling anxious, I hold on to that thought. Lots of other people here are feeling anxious too. So that really helps me. What also helps me is what we talked about earlier about kind of that exposure. So sometimes very gently stepping into the things that we're feeling anxious about and surviving them. And and often not only do we survive, but we thrive. So today I felt anxious starting this webinar, and I held in mind, I'm not probably giving myself, I'm not recognizing my competence here. I'm under kind of valuing my competence. And it's the same when we're walking into a room. Typically, we have the competence to walk in and to do the thing that we need to do, whether that's say hello or go to a meeting or to have a coffee with somebody. And now as we gently do that and expose ourselves to the situation, it's recognizing, I survived that. I did quite well there. And then holding on to that knowledge for the next time.
Yeah, it's so key, isn't it? And like we could talk all day and all week about sort of convincing each other of that, but it's the lived experience, isn't it? Like there's no other learning that offers that, as you say, to go into something that's difficult and to thrive in it and to come out and think, well, yeah, I did that, even though it was difficult. And those experiences really build up. The more, as you say, you can take those steps into things that can kind of generate anxiety. They're the things that can really help break the cycle, aren't they?
Yeah. And then coming back to self-compassion,
Yeah.
if you're feeling really anxious walking into a situation, being really compassionate towards yourself, feeling really anxious, and that's okay. This is a normal shared human experience. What do I need to do to look after myself in this moment? Maybe it's taking a few deep breaths. Maybe it's allowing myself to go to the toilet to ground myself for a few minutes if I find myself feeling particularly anxious. Maybe it's allowing myself to not stay until closing time. Maybe I can go home, at a time that works for me. So allowing yourself to feel this way, knowing it's a shared human experience, that it's okay, it's normal, and looking after yourself in that. That's really helpful too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I guess it shifts the experience. Instead of saying, no, I shouldn't feel anxious, I'm just going to plow through. It'll probably go away in the end. There's a taking action, as you say, and that's based on that kind of compassionate approach. The first step is sort of acknowledging it. That's key, and then doing something for you. Gosh, the hour's gone so fast. I think, Clodagh, it's been so fascinating to speak to you. I think I'm really glad you did the webinar. And it's interesting, as you say, that kind of anxiety, which I share, before we came on, but I think you've offered something so informative and so valuable, and really normalizing, actually. It's really, really helpful. And I'm sorry if I haven't got to all of the questions. But hopefully there'll be a lot of kind of stuff here to think about. I wonder, before we kind of wrap up and I move to the webinar for next month, just in terms of kind of what you think kind of is maybe the most important thing you would want someone to take away with them from our conversation today.
I always say we are far more alike than we realize. And I would love for the people listening who struggle in any way, whether it's with anxiety or with anything else, to know that you are experiencing a shared human experience, that we all, often so many of us experience those things. You're not alone, and there is support there. So there is your GP, there's psychological services, there's Instagram pages like mine, there's podcasts like mine, there's lots of places that we can go to seek support and to just remember you're not alone in any of it.
Yeah, thank you. And it's such a good point. There's lots of different types of support. So if you find something that doesn't quite fit, keep looking. You
Yeah.
know, there will be something that works for you as an individual. Yeah. Oh, Clodagh, thank you so much. Really, really grateful for joining me today talking about anxiety. And moving on to the next month's webinar. So hopefully many of you can join us again. So that is going to be the benefits of peer support in managing depression. That's on the 13th of December. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Clodagh, and hopefully see you all next month.